Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the AAS YouTube, and this one is going down the AAS Scientific Editor Series, and I'm super happy to have Scientific Editor Gary Zank with us today. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Frank. How are you?
Doing reasonably well for late July in Phoenix. We're sitting at about 110, 112F today. Humidity's up because this is the monsoon season time in Phoenix, so we get sort of that Gulf moisture coming up from, I think, where you are, coming up into the southwestern states. So where are you at?
Alabama, and also enjoying high temperatures and hot humidity, and hoping to send as much of it down to you or across to you.
Well, you're doing a good job of it. So that is a very awesome bookshelf behind you. You got quite a collection there.
Yeah, I try to spend as much time as I can looking at it or reading from it, but it's never enough, and some AppJ editorial duties take me away from spending as much time there as I would like, but nonetheless.
Well invested, well invested.
Yes.
Cool. So what do you like to do for research, Gary?
So my research background is pretty much plasma physics in an astrophysical and space physical setting. So I worry about magnetic fields and how charged particles interact with that. And so I spend a lot of my time, probably more in the space physics world, which is also related to the editorial duties that I have. The sort of physical area that my interests encompass range from the sort of more or less local interstellar medium, although I've played around a little with the interstellar medium and supernova remnants a little bit, all the way down to just above the photosphere, the surface of the sun. And so I'm involved in a couple of spacecraft or several spacecraft missions, some of which are involved in exploring now the boundaries of the heliosphere with the interstellar medium. And at the other end, I'm involved also with solar probe, Parker Solar Probe, and the European Solar Orbiter. I'm a co-I on both of those, and exploring sort of the innermost parts of the heliosphere. So
cool.
And everything in between, yeah.
So how did you get into that field as opposed to something like condensed matter or biophysics? I'm always curious how people get into the fields they get into.
Well, the story for me is, you know, some of the parties have died, so I suppose I can I can give the background story. But I started off actually wanting to study partial differential equations. My background was actually applied mathematics, and so I started working with somebody back in South Africa, and he'd given me a project that I kind of was thinking was a little bit dull, and I went in to his office and explained that I'd much rather be studying something that was relatively new at the time called pseudo-differential operators. And his response to me was, "You must be crazy if you think I'm going to learn anything new at my age." And so, so I figured this was probably not the best person with whom to do a master's degree or a PhD. And so I went and cried on the shoulder of somebody who happened to be in the department and living next door to me. I sort of rented a cheap apartment, and he had the expensive house. And so I went and sort of cried on his shoulder about this. I did not know at the time that there was a complicated political struggle within the department about who should be the new chair. And by doing what I had done, I had inadvertently stumbled into the politics of all of this. But he offered me a research, or suggested a research project that was plasma physics focused, and sounded much more exciting. And I didn't have to worry about whether or not he wanted to learn anything new in his life at that particular stage. So in that regard, it was a marriage made in heaven, and I've never really looked back.
Cool. Yeah. So given all the time in between, what are some of your current research projects?
So a couple of things that have just appeared sort of in the AppJ is I I was looking at interstellar turbulence, but measured in situ. So it was actually turbulence measured in the very local interstellar medium by the Voyager 1 spacecraft.
Yeah.
And that was particularly interesting because the first measurements that came back suggested that turbulence in the very local interstellar medium was highly compressible. It all looked like compressible waves, which was a huge surprise because everything we know about the transport and the propagation of cosmic rays is based on the assumption that turbulence in the interstellar medium is incompressible, and primarily Alfvén fluctuations and or small scale incompressible quasi 2D structures. So, so this was both a huge surprise and great theoretical challenge, which is what I am, a theoretician more. And so so I managed to explain why Voyager 1 should be seeing compressible fluctuations. In some sense, it's a little bit analogous to banging on a drum. The so-called heliopause is a contact discontinuity, and it's being banged on the inside by a lot of compressible fluctuations. And it turns out that it's only compressible fluctuations that can be transmitted across the heliopause into the interstellar medium.
Okay.
So that kind of explained why you saw compressible fluctuations, but Voyager, or the Voyager mission as a whole, never fails to surprise. And so it turned out that when one got 10 astronomical units and more beyond the heliopause, it no longer saw any compressible turbulence. But what it did not see was a corresponding decrease in the amplitude of the turbulence. And so it evidently didn't disappear, but something happened to turn it into incompressible turbulence.
Right.
And so that again was a surprise and another challenge for any theoretician. And so I wrote another paper showing that the compressible turbulence underwent a mode conversion to become incompressible turbulence. And so so in and of itself, it was very interesting, but it also suggests on a larger astrophysical, from a larger astrophysical perspective, that in fact stars, O stars, which may be much more active than our rather puny ordinary sun, may in fact seed their own very local interstellar media as a result of this kind of process. Cool. So that's one of the things that I've just been playing with a little bit. So it's kind of fun.
Very nice. So that's some of your recent papers. What was your very not AJ paper, and what's sort of your history with the AAS journal?
Not even sure I remember. It's been a while, a long time. It probably had to do with work related to either turbulence in the solar wind and its relation to cosmic ray transport. Cosmic rays are scattered by turbulence, and so understanding that process tells us a lot about where they come from, how they're modulated or mediated as they enter the heliosphere. It could be that, or it could have been a paper on trying to explain the origin of the so-called anomalous cosmic ray component, which for a long time was thought to be primarily due to diffusive shock acceleration at the heliospheric termination shock.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so any of those, but a lot of the papers were also since then related to the large-scale structure of the heliosphere, which is complicated because of its interaction with the interstellar medium. The interstellar medium is partially ionized, and so simple traditional MHD-like models are inappropriate, and you have to take into account the rather complicated charge exchange interaction with interstellar neutrals as they drift through the heliosphere.
Cool. I'm always curious why people choose to become a scientific editor. And so when did you start and what was your motivation?
I think it was probably about 8 years ago, I suppose. The motivation was a phone call from Ethan Vishniak, who has,
very persuasive.
Yes, exactly. He has a persuasive way about him.
Go, Ethan.
So I thought a little bit about it, but from the outset, I was pretty much agreeable. And part of the reason I was agreeable was, in addition to my usual sort of professor activities of teaching and mentoring students and so forth, I've been chair of my Department of Space Science since I founded it. But I've also been director of a Center for Space Plasma and Aeronomic Research. So there's a fair amount of administrative duties that I have to spend my time on, which are not the most exciting or enjoyable. And I would advise anybody who happens to stumble across this interview to avoid administrative tasks at all costs. But sometimes one is dragged into it, kicking and protesting. And so I've developed various ways of managing to keep up with the scientific literature. One of them is I organize at least one or two conferences every year, and people are good enough to attend them, and it's
nice.
And I organize them for largely selfish reasons. I basically identify all the people I particularly want to hear about what science they're doing, and they come and tell me in a sense. So it gives me a concentrated week of at least getting on top of things. But I also saw the AppJ editorial activities as, on the one hand, a sort of selfish reason. It gave me an opportunity to almost be forced to keep up with the literature. And so that's a very useful and helpful thing. But the other thing that I'd long felt is that I also wanted an opportunity to, in some sense, give back. I've been very fortunate. I've enjoyed doing the work I do, and people have been very encouraging. I remember receiving many encouraging and stimulating referee reports. And I've often thought that the editors did a really good job in perhaps identifying people who might be able to contribute in some sense to the work I was doing as a researcher and author. And so I wanted to try to be able to do the same thing for a different, another new up and coming generation. And so I guess one of the things I'm particularly conscious of in doing this job is making sure that especially younger and new people coming into the field really get a fair shot and get a kind of encouragement from the referees. So I'm very conscious about who I try to choose, especially for younger people. And then on the flip side, I spend quite a lot of time trying to bring young people into the refereeing process because A, they've got more time often than their older colleagues.
Yeah.
B, they're often much more attuned to the current literature than some of our older colleagues. And C, it also gives them an opportunity to start to shape the field a little bit as well. They can point out important and interesting publications, perhaps their own or others that sometimes other authors are unaware of, or especially older authors may not be quite as cognizant of. And so it's those are sort of some of the sort of motivators that I have.
Cool. So you got sort of, first one you remarked was somewhat selfish, and the other one is, second one there is sort of altruistic. So you got a blend going there.
Yeah, although I'd like it to be more selfish in some sense, and be able to spend more time reading these really interesting papers that cross my desk. But Leon, who is my sort of the person who sends me the manuscripts, makes sure to ensure that I have enough on my plate to keep me busy. So.
So speaking of that, roughly how many new submissions do you get per week?
It can vary. I mean, you know, on a quiet week, it may be 4.
Okay.
But it's typically quite a lot more than that often.
Okay.
But you know, it's always at a more or less manageable level. But you know, there's always a good, I don't know, you know, sort of 20 papers plus, 20, 30 papers plus that are sitting out there that I'm waiting for reports to come in on and so on. So a couple of the papers tend to be much more time intensive, time consuming than others. You know, so things happen. Yeah.
Yes. So as long as we're getting onto that topic, what do you think makes for a good, solid initial submission?
So it depends. Obviously, it depends on where the author's coming from to some extent. So you know, I will occasionally get, and to be honest, contribute, you know, a 50, 60, 70 long page paper that is, you know, very extensive theoretical analysis or derivation of something. Could be, you know, the 300th derivation of the cosmic ray transport equation done from a different perspective. You know, almost always they're interesting, but almost invariably they're enormously, you know, laborious and you know, calculationally challenging or extensive. So those papers, you know, have a very, they require a very different kind of refereeing, a very different kind of perspective. And so they can be very well written, very clearly written, but can be very dense. And so those papers, what I at least try to look for is a clearly motivated, clearly articulated explanation for why I need to look at the 300th or more derivation of the cosmic ray transport equation. And so I need to know pretty quickly, well up front, what is it that's particularly novel about this approach? And is it more than simply an exercise in doing, you know, an interesting derivation from a different mathematical perspective? And will it give me some new physical insight? And so if it doesn't really meet those criteria, then as interesting mathematically as it may be, it would probably be better suited to another journal, maybe a more mathematically focused or a more plasma physics as a discipline focused journal. On the other hand, just as I sort of described, if somebody sends me in a paper, the Voyager paper, for example, telling us that there's compressible turbulence in the interstellar medium, and you know, there's just you know, that paper sells itself. It has you know, a remarkable and interesting new and undoubtedly sort of a result that will have you know, considerable impact. And so all that I really need to look at there is, A, is the result presented in a way that is compelling and physically sound, and that is you know, fairly easily judged by a good referee. And equally, the paper that comes along and says, here's why you're seeing what you're seeing, and this is really an interesting physical result. And again, it often will have much broader implications than just that very narrow observation. That too is a paper that's easily sold. So, you know, there it's just a matter of really clarity, explaining the significance of the observation and doing the analysis, whether observational or theoretical, properly. And then, yeah, pretty much I think that covers the two ranges of the kinds of papers that I come across. I mean, there's stuff in between, and papers that don't do well are papers that are extremely narrowly focused on a particular problem issue that really is of interest to maybe 4, 5, 8 other people in the world, and then I have a hard time really determining whether or not this should appear in AppJ, no matter how well it's written or motivated.
So let me put this spin on this question this way, since you touched on the altruistic of bringing younger authors around, and perhaps you already touched on what you just talked about, but I wanted to see if you had any extra tips for younger authors coming into the field. How should they frame their submissions?
I think so again, you know, again, to me, really, first of all, you know, the importance of the problem. Is it one for AppJ, again, I'm framing this for AppJ, but is it one that A, is fundamentally interesting, and B, should have implications that are a little larger than the particular field, perhaps, that they're working in? So, you know, particle acceleration addressed within a space physics context is as interesting to particle acceleration for people interested in the interstellar medium or supernova remnants or something else. So there's a clear and obvious kind of, expansion. Turbulence is the same kind of thing. And so you could even talk about, you know, turbulence, even in the upper atmosphere, would be just as interesting to a space physicist as an astrophysicist put in context. So, you know, a kind of slightly broader perspective, I think, is critical. The second thing that's absolutely critical for a younger author is clarity. Can you explain, first of all, the problem in perhaps in non-technical terms? Because if you can do that, you really are sufficiently comfortable and clear with the problem that you're discussing. And I'm sure that many young authors have noticed that their mentors or even their PhD examiners or their postdoc advisors will often say to them, you know, can you just give me a 2-3 sentence summary of what you're doing without using jargon or without writing down an equation? And I think, you know, having that level of understanding coming in to write your paper makes it a much, much better paper.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Let's go on the flip side. Referee reports. What do you think makes for a good referee report?
I think somebody who approaches the problem with empathy and interest. Okay. And obviously standards. So I think recognizing that people look at problems from many different perspectives. The first thing I don't like from a referee, for example, is I don't like a referee who basically tries to rewrite the paper or reframe the paper in a way that she or he thinks it ought to be written. It's the author writing, and referee's job is really to evaluate the scientific content and worth of the paper, evaluate whether it expresses the ideas as clearly as it can, and the second point does not mean that you rewrite the paper for the author. You can point out that there are areas that are unclear or poorly expressed, that things need to be improved. So for me, I really don't need, I would have done it this way, and I think you should do it that way or something, unless there's a good scientific rationale behind that. But that's probably my biggest beef. Oh, well, actually, no. Let me back up. That is my biggest beef from well-intentioned referees.
Right.
My other biggest beef, unfortunately it doesn't happen, is that I get occasionally referees who unfortunately can be kind of mean, and they don't seem to recognize that that isn't helpful.
Right. Yeah, and depending on content depends a little bit on how you address that as a scientific editor. So
Yeah, very, very often. There have been a number of occasions where I have simply not forwarded the report, and I've, written back to the authors and said, I've received a report that I'm not satisfied with, and if you don't mind it taking a little longer, I'm going to go out and find another referee. And I should say that that has happened not only in terms of unpleasant referee reports, and by unpleasant I mean just unpleasant, not scientifically unpleasant news, but simply unpleasant.
Right.
And there have been other reports which have been completely unhelpful, along the lines of the authors are using the wrong set of equations, and therefore this paper should be rejected. And I really have had one or two of those.
Okay.
It's a completely pointless exercise. So, again, I have to go out and find somebody who would be willing to invest a little more time and energy and effort into that.
Please ask something topical on that. How often do you will you willingly go out and get two referees for a paper? I mean, one is sort of our standard. Some people do two more or less regularly, and I'm just kind of curious where you fall.
I think I'm pretty much in the middle ground. I tend to try to use my judgment, but then I get, and there have been occasions, and sort of have responded in real time to the referee, to the authors. But there have been occasions where I've gone through two or three, or sometimes four, but two or three sort of back and forths between a referee and the authors, and on at least a couple of times, I've felt that it was inappropriate or unnecessary even to bring in a second referee.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've sort of arrived at a determination not to, and informed the authors, and then the authors have written back with a lengthy but, and there have been a couple of occasions where I've sort of said, okay, maybe I'll need to go out and go back to a second, or even on one occasion, a third referee, and I will then send an email to our long-suffering Janice, apologizing profusely and asking her to resurrect the paper. and then I will then track down a second or a third referee and start the process over again. I mean, I really feel that under most circumstances, I do try to err on the side of too much rather than too little. But there are occasional papers where it's just clear this is not going to work, and I will at that point just say, I'm sorry, I'm not doing this any further.
To make the tough decision. Yep. So speaking of Janice, or otherwise, is there anything else you'd like to share about the AAS journal editorial process?
Well, I have to admit that it is the website and the assistance that is provided by people like Janice and the other
Alex.
and the other people. Alex is one of them. It's just really outstanding. It makes my life incredibly easy, because I always feel there are a couple of resources of which Janice reigns supreme, that can make my life, that can sort out almost every problem that I'm faced with, short of how do I deal with a nasty referee or a nasty author. But other than that, right. I think Janice has it covered, and the others have it covered. So I'm incredibly grateful to all of them, and it makes working on AppJ a real pleasure. It really does.
Yeah, Janice pulled me out of my own nonsense today. I had a manuscript that I had sent back to the authors because they had multiple tables, and it looked like a good fraction of those tables were not referenced in the text at all. So no, you got to reference tables in the text. And so I sent it back, and as it turned out, the author ended up using some pretty non-standard notation for the tables. It eluded both the referee and eluded me on the search, but in fact, once informed of their non-standard cryptography on the tables, they were there. So I needed to, I wanted to reverse my decision to revise and just accept the paper and just flag it as, okay, this is something the copy editors are going to have to deal with. And so I put myself in a pickle, and Janice came in and saved me about a year ago. And so I really appreciate that.
Yeah. I think that's probably the story of all the J editors.
I don't know how I did what I did, but I ended up in this strange state. So that's great. Awesome. Gary, I want to thank you so much for spending some time and talking with everyone today about how you handle the scientific editor position.
You're very welcome, and I guess I'll get back to trying to figure out a way to shorten a proposal by a page.
Oh, that's another fun one. All righty. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank you then, Frank. Bye-bye then.